I didn't realize I was raising two children until I finally stopped carrying them both. Let's just get to the start of the issues. My husband Milo used to leave his socks on the living room floor. At first I found it almost charming. We had just moved in together and everything still felt new and hopeful. I would pick them up, toss them in the hamper, and smile to myself. This is what living together looks like, I thought. Back then, I believed partnership was about filling in each other's gaps. I just did not realize I would be the only one filling the socks turned into dishes left beside the sink. Not inside it, beside it. Then came the laundry that made it to the washing machine, but never to the dryer. Wet clothes would sit there for days until I would discover them and rewash everything because it smelled damp. I told myself he was busy. Milo worked long hours at a warehouse, and I knew he came home tired. I worked too, but I convinced myself that my job was less draining. I made excuses for him before he ever had to make them himself. I told myself relationships were not about keeping score. The problem with not keeping score is that someone else always is, even if they pretend not to be. When our daughter Emma was born, everything intensified in ways I was not prepared for. Sleep deprivation stripped away the illusions I had carefully constructed. There is something about pacing the hallway at 3 a.m. with a crying baby that makes you see your life with brutal clarity. Milo slept through most of it. At first, I let him. He had to work in the morning, I reasoned. I was on maternity leave, so it made sense for me to handle the night feedings. It was temporary. But temporary stretched into months. Milo would roll over when Emma cried. Sometimes he would sigh dramatically, as if her hunger were an inconvenience done to him personally. I would sit up, already moving and starting to calculate how many hours of sleep I might get before morning. In the daylight, he was affectionate with her. He would take photos and post them online. He wrote captions about how blessed he felt to be a father. Friends would comment about how lucky I was to have such a hands-on partner. I stared at those comments longer than I should have. Hands-on meant holding her for pictures. It did not mean changing diapers without being asked, washing bottles, or waking up at night. If I asked him to help, he would. That was his defense. All you have to do is ask. I began to hate that sentence. Asking meant I had to notice everything first. It meant the mental load was mine. I had to ask because if I did not, nothing happened. I became the project manager of our entire life. Doctor appointments, grocery lists, diaper inventory, bills, cleaning schedules, family birthdays, thank you cards, holiday planning, daycare research. Milo waited for instructions the way an employee waits for a supervisor. I tried to communicate. I wrote chore lists on the fridge. I suggested we split responsibilities and explained that I was overwhelmed. He would just nod, agree, and promise to do better. For a week, maybe 2, he would make an effort. The trash would go out before it overflowed, the dishes would be loaded without prompting, and I would feel hope start to bloom inside my chest. Then slowly, inevitably, everything would slide back. The frustration did not come all at once. It accumulated like dust in corners I no longer had time to clean. When I returned to work full-time, I thought that would shift things. Surely he would see that I was no longer home all day. Surely the reality of 2 working parents would force a more balanced dynamic. Instead, my days became a marathon. I would wake up before everyone else to pack lunches. I would get Emma dressed and coordinate daycare drop-off because Milo's schedule made mornings hard. After work, I would rush to pick her up because his commute was longer. I would cook dinner because he was starving. I would clean because he was going to do it later. The house began to feel like a physical representation of my resentment. Toys scattered across the floor, crumbs on the counter, and laundry in uneven piles. Every surface seemed to whisper that I was alone. What frustrated me most was not the tasks themselves. It was the invisibility. Milo would sit on the couch scrolling through his phone while I wiped down the table 2 feet away from him. He would step over a basket of unfolded laundry as if it were decorative. He did not see what I saw. Or maybe he did, and he just trusted that I would handle it. One evening stands out in my memory like a warning flare I ignored. Emma had a fever and I had a deadline at work. The dishwasher had broken and the sink was full of dirty bottles. Milo had the day off. I came home expecting relief. But instead, I walked into a living room that looked like a tornado had passed through it. Emma was in her crib crying while Milo was in the bedroom playing a video game with headphones. Only remember the exact sensation in my chest. It was not anger at first, it was disbelief. He had not heard her, or maybe he had and assumed I would. Be home soon. I picked her up, feeling her hot skin against mine, and something shifted inside me that night. After Emma finally fell asleep, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes by hand. Milo came in and asked what was for dinner. I stared at him for a long time before answering. It was not the question itself. It was the assumption behind it. I began to imagine what my life would look like without him. The thought felt dangerous and disloyal. But it also felt lighter, however. I stayed because I believed in commitment. Because I thought every relationship went through rough patches and I was telling myself he would grow up. I did not realize that hoping someone will change can slowly erode. Milo began working fewer hours after a shift reduction at the warehouse. He framed it as temporary. I tried to be supportive and I told him we would adjust. I picked up extra responsibilities at work to compensate financially. Somehow, despite him working less, I ended up doing more at home. I would leave for work while he was still asleep and come home to find dishes from breakfast still on the counter. Emma would be watching television, still in the pajamas I dressed her in that morning. Toys would be scattered across every room. Milo would greet me with a tired expression and tell me how exhausting his day had been. He had folded one load of laundry. He made sure to mention that. The imbalance became almost surreal. I began waking up earlier just to create order before the chaos of the day. I packed lunches, scheduled pediatrician visits, and paid bills before sunrise. I learned to operate on 4 hours of sleep because the alternative was drowning. The house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a workplace where I was both manager and janitor. One Saturday, I decided not to do anything. It was a small experiment that felt like a quiet rebellion. I did not clean the kitchen after breakfast. I did not pick up toys. And I did not start laundry. I simply existed. I played with Emma, read a book, and waited. By mid-afternoon, the mess had multiplied, but Milo stepped around it. He grabbed snacks, leaving wrappers behind. He scrolled on his phone and never once looked at the growing disaster as something he could fix. When he finally asked why the house was such a mess, something inside me hardened permanently. The breaking point did not come from a single catastrophic event. It came from repetition. From being asked what was for dinner after I worked 10 hours to watching him nap while I scrubbed the bathroom and hearing him tell friends how we were doing great one night. After Emma had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and calculated how much I contributed financially, emotionally, and physically. The numbers were not even close. Milo talked often about feeling overwhelmed. He said he felt criticized, and that I expected too much. I began lowering my expectations in ways that frightened me. I stopped asking him to help with bedtime and expecting him to notice when we were low on groceries. I stopped believing he would step up. The less I expected, the less he gave, and the more I felt like a single parent who happened to share a house with another adult. Tension in our home shifted from loud frustration to quiet distance. We stopped laughing as much and touching as often. Conversations became logistical exchanges about schedules and bills. One day, Emma had a stomach virus. She was vomiting every hour through the night. I stayed up with her, holding a bowl, wiping her face, and whispering reassurance. Milo slept in the guest room because he had an early morning. At 6 a.m., exhausted and nauseated myself, I asked him if he could take over for an hour so I could rest. He hesitated before saying he needed sleep to function. Something inside me went completely still. I looked at him and saw not a partner, but another responsibility. That morning, as I watched him leave for coffee with a friend while I stayed home with a sick child and a sink full of dishes, I understood something with terrifying clarity. If I was already doing everything alone, then I was not afraid of being alone. The idea of leaving stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling practical. And once that thought takes root, it changes everything. I began to detach quietly. I stopped reminding him about appointments. If he forgot, he forgot. I stopped covering for him with friends and family and absorbing his responsibilities as if they were mine by default. The house grew messier while the silence grew louder. And Milo still did not notice what he was losing. It was not dramatic. I did not announce it or threaten to leave. I simply stopped cushioning his failures. And without the cushion, everything hit harder. Milo's reduced hours eventually turned into no hours at all. The warehouse cut staff permanently. He came home one afternoon with a tight jaw and said it was out of his control. He said the economy was terrible and he would find something quickly. I believed him, at least. At first, the first week I gave him space. Losing a job is destabilizing. I encouraged him. I updated my budget spreadsheets and reassured him we would be fine if we tightened things temporarily. The second week, I noticed his alarm stopped going off in the mornings. The third week, I realized he was not applying for jobs consistently. I would come home to find him in the same spot on the couch where I had left him. Controller in hand, television glowing. He told me he had applied to a few places. When I asked which ones, he could not remember the names. I began working overtime to make ends meet. Emma was now 3 years old, energetic and perceptive. She began asking why Daddy was always home. She began asking why Daddy did not come to the park with us. He was tired. I would tell her the financial pressure grew sharp. I paid the mortgage, I paid utilities, I paid daycare, I bought groceries, all while I canceled subscriptions quietly, hoping he would notice and understand the urgency. He did not notice. Instead, he began complaining about feeling down. He said he felt unmotivated and he needed time to figure himself out. I suggested counseling. I offered to help him update his resume and sent him job listings. He just thanked me, then went back to the couch. One afternoon, I came home early because Emma's daycare had closed unexpectedly. I expected to find Milo handling the surprise smoothly since he was home. Instead, I found Emma in front of the television. Again, eating dry cereal from a mixing bowl. The sink was full, the trash was overflowing, and Milo was asleep in the bedroom. He was fast asleep at 2 in the afternoon. Something inside me did not flare with anger this time. It cooled. That cooling was more dangerous than any argument we had ever had. I cleaned the kitchen in silence. I bathed Emma, and I made dinner. Milo emerged around 6 p.m., stretching and asking casually what I had done that day. I realized then that he genuinely believed we were navigating this together. He believed unemployment meant a break, and my income meant security. He believed my endurance was endless. The resentment no longer felt sharp. It felt heavy. Like carrying a backpack full of stones I could not put down. Bills began arriving with red notices. I showed them to him. I did not yell. I simply placed them on the table between us. He said he would handle it. He did not. I ended up paying them. Everything escalated when Emma caught pneumonia that winter. She needed breathing treatments every 4 hours. I took unpaid leave from work because Milo said medical equipment made him anxious. He said he was afraid of doing it wrong. So, I learned it. I set alarms through the night, monitored her oxygen levels, and cleaned the nebulizer equipment. I held her while she cried through treatments. Milo slept instead of helping. He said he needed rest so he could be strong for us. One night, while I was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed waiting for her breathing to steady, I realized I could not remember the last time Milo had done something hard without being asked. The thought settled like truth. When Emma recovered, I expected gratitude and hoped for a renewed sense of shared responsibility after a scare. Instead, Milo suggested we should take a small vacation to decompress. With what money, I wondered. The dissonance became unbearable. Friends began pulling away subtly and invitations slowed. I realized I had stopped showing up to gatherings because I was embarrassed that I was paying for everything. Embarrassed that my husband did not work, and that I felt more alone married than I ever did single. One evening, the power went out. I had miscalculated a due date. I had been juggling so many deadlines that I had forgotten one bill. Milo was furious. He demanded to know how I could let that happen. He said it was irresponsible and I needed to stay on top of things. I stared at him in the dark, lit only by my phone screen, and something irreversible snapped. He did not see the irony or the cruelty that night. I lay awake listening to him breathe beside me and realized his presence no longer comforted me, it burdened me. And the frightening part was, I was no longer scared of losing him. I was scared of staying. There is a moment in every long unraveling where pretending becomes more exhausting than truth. One day, Emma's preschool hosted a small performance. Parents were invited and Milo promised he would come. He assured me he would not miss it and said he wanted to be more involved. I left work early and saved him a seat. Emma stood on that small stage in a paper sun costume, scanning the crowd. Her eyes searched for both of us. Milo did not show up. He texted 30 minutes after the show ended. He said he lost track of time, and he was sorry. I watched Emma's face as the other children ran into both of their parents' arms. I hugged her alone. When we got home, Milo was on the couch. He apologized again and said he felt terrible. But then he said I was overreacting when I did not respond warmly that night. I opened a separate bank account. I began redirecting a portion of my paycheck. I stopped covering for him with my parents. When they asked why he was not working yet, I told them the truth. When friends asked why he missed events, I stopped inventing excuses. Without my protection, his inaction became visible. He grew defensive. He said I was making him look bad and I was not being supportive. Support had become synonymous with silence. The house grew colder and he began accusing me of being distant. He said I was different and I did not appreciate him. I looked around at the laundry, the unpaid parking ticket on the counter, and the stack of job listings untouched on the table. What was I supposed to be appreciating? The final fracture came during a snowstorm. I had to work remotely and Emma's preschool was closed. The driveway was buried and Milo had been up late gaming and was still asleep at 10 a.m. Emma had a mild fever again. I needed groceries and the driveway needed shoveling so I could get to the pharmacy. I asked Milo to clear it and he said he would. In a minute, an hour passed. I bundled Emma in layers and began shoveling myself. The snow was heavy and wet. My gloves soaked through and my back ached. Emma stood at the window watching. Halfway through, Milo opened the door and asked why I had not waited for him. I did not answer. The image of me shoveling snow alone while my unemployed husband stood inside etched itself into my mind permanently. I finished the driveway, loaded Emma into the car and drove to the pharmacy. And during that drive, something in me finalized. When I came home, I looked at Milo with clarity I had avoided for too long. He was not a partner struggling temporarily. He was comfortable that night. After Emma went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and began researching apartments. Soon, Milo was going to find out what it felt like when the person holding everything together finally let go. Once I made the decision to leave, something inside me shifted in a way I had not anticipated. I had expected to feel devastation, panic, or at least some dramatic emotional unraveling. But instead what settled over me was a profound and steady sense of focus. It was as if the years of confusion and resentment had finally condensed into clarity. And with that clarity came calm. I did not feel triumphant. I simply felt resolved. There were no ultimatums delivered across the kitchen table, no raised voices echoing down the hallway, and no final fight that shattered what little peace remained in our home. I did not threaten him in hopes that fear would spark change, because I had already learned that fear only sparked temporary effort. Instead, I moved quietly. I found a modest 2-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from Emma's preschool, tucked into a complex that was neither impressive nor rundown, just functional and steady. The carpet was older than I preferred, and the kitchen was narrow enough that only one person could comfortably move around at a time. But when I walked through it alone for the first time, I felt something lift off my chest. The air felt lighter, and there was no invisible tension humming in the walls. The rent fit within my budget, without requiring miracles or sacrifices that bordered on desperation. And that practicality mattered more to me than aesthetics. For the first time in years, I calculated finances without factoring in someone else's unpredictability. After signing the lease, preparation became methodical. I began moving things slowly so the shift would not feel abrupt to Emma, and so Milo would not sense the full weight of what was coming until I was ready. What struck me most was how little he noticed. Years of disengagement had trained him not to observe details, and now that inattention worked in my favor. The house looked the same on the surface, but internally, everything had changed. The resentment that once burned so hot inside me had cooled into something more sustainable. I no longer waited for him to help. I no longer felt crushed when he did not. I had already detached from the expectation. Eventually, he sensed something was different. He began hovering slightly more in shared spaces. He offered to cook one evening, though the kitchen looked like a disaster by the time he finished. He mentioned updating his resume and spoke vaguely about opportunities that might materialize soon. He talked about our plans in a tone that assumed continuity. It felt surreal listening to him describe a future that I knew would not include the version of us he imagined. The day I told him was unremarkable. Emma was at preschool, and the television cast a flickering blue light across the living room, while Milo sat in his usual spot on the couch. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, not with bitterness or fury, but with the clarity that only comes after prolonged endurance. I told him I had signed a lease and that Emma and I would be moving out that weekend for a moment. He looked at me as if I had spoken something absurd. Disbelief passed across his face first, followed by confusion, and then a tightening panic that suggested he finally understood the gravity of what I was saying. He asked why, though I suspect he already knew. I did not recite a list of grievances or recount the snowstorm, the missed performance, the unpaid bills, or the nights spent alone beside a sick child while he slept undisturbed. I simply told him that I could not continue carrying everything alone. He promised we could fix it. The words sounded painfully familiar, like a refrain I had heard too many times to believe anymore. He insisted that every couple struggles and that I was overreacting. He said I was giving up too easily. He suggested I was tearing apart our family without allowing him enough time to improve. Time had been the one resource I had given in abundance that weekend. I packed openly. He moved through the house in waves of anger and pleading, alternating between accusing me of abandonment and promising sudden transformation. He said he would change. He said he had simply needed more support. Support in his understanding had always meant silence. Emma viewed the move as an adventure because I framed it that way. I showed her pictures of her new room and let her choose small decorations. Her excitement steadied me when doubt attempted to surface. When the car was loaded and the last box was placed inside, Milo stood on the porch watching. He did not help carry anything, but he also didn't physically block us. He simply stood there, arms crossed, as if waiting for me to hesitate. Driving away felt strangely peaceful. I had imagined heartbreak crashing into me, but instead my shoulders dropped as if I had set down something I had been holding for years without realizing how heavy it was. The first night in the apartment, after Emma fell asleep in her new bed, I sat alone in the quiet and listened carefully. There was no tension pressing in from another room. No low-grade anxiety about what had not been done, and no resentment humming beneath ordinary sounds. Just quiet. The weeks that followed were not dramatic or chaotic, as I had once feared they might be. Instead, they unfolded with a steady rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. Without Milo in the house, daily life streamlined itself in ways that surprised me. There were fewer dishes accumulating in the sink, fewer piles of laundry spreading across furniture, and fewer unfinished tasks lingering in corners waiting for my attention. The absence of another adult to manage eliminated an invisible layer of labor I had grown so accustomed to carrying that I no longer recognized it as separate from normal life. I was still responsible for Emma and household work, but I was no longer responsible for compensating for someone else's inertia financially. Things were tighter, but there was a strange pride in knowing that every bill paid and every meal on the table came directly from my own consistency. There were no hidden variables and no waiting to see whether someone else would follow through. Milo's life, meanwhile, began to unravel in ways that made the previous imbalance painfully obvious. Without me quietly maintaining the infrastructure of our shared life, cracks became visible. He struggled to keep up with mortgage payments and eventually reached out asking if I could contribute just temporarily to help him stabilize. I declined, not out of vindictiveness, but because enabling him had been the foundation of our dysfunction. The house was eventually listed for sale, Friends who had once praised his relaxed demeanor began noticing patterns they had previously overlooked. The charm of being easygoing fades quickly when there is no one else absorbing the consequences. Moment that solidified everything occurred when he forgot to pick Emma up from preschool during one of his scheduled afternoons. The school called me at work, their tone calm but concerned. Emma was safe, sitting beside her teacher, but she was confused. Milo had overslept. I left work immediately and drove across town with a clarity that felt almost clinical. There was no explosive anger or screaming confrontation. I adjusted custody arrangements through proper channels. Emma began sleeping through the night consistently. Her teachers mentioned that she seemed more focused and more secure. Our small apartment began to feel less like a temporary solution and more like a deliberate choice. I noticed my own transformation gradually. I smiled more, and not in the strained way I once had when trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. I no longer felt the constant low hum of disappointment vibrating beneath ordinary moments. Milo continued insisting that he had changed. He found part-time work eventually and spoke about wanting to rebuild what we had. But by then something essential had shifted beyond repair. His efforts, though perhaps sincere, were reactive rather than transformative. They were responses to consequence, not evidence of internal growth that could have prevented the consequence in the first place. The most satisfying realization was not watching him struggle or witnessing the collapse of the life we once shared. It was recognizing that I had not destroyed anything. I had simply stopped holding it up alone. Milo had believed I would never leave because I had endured so much already. He had mistaken resilience for permanence. He had believed my willingness to carry everything meant I would always continue. He was wrong. Because the moment I stopped carrying him, I discovered I had been strong enough all along. And walking away was not failure, it was freedom.